Welcome to the Fly Phenomenon Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hazen, and with me again is Ted Haycraft.
Of Cinema Chat.
You got to get in a plug for your other show.
I guess I should because I may be resurrecting it here next week or so.
Oh, because of COVID.
Because the theaters are opening back up.
And you're braving going to a theater.
I may have to do that. See a few films.
What do you plan on seeing?
To keep my streak of silly superhero films, I guess I'll go see New Mutants. Kind of curious to see.
I heard someone compare that movie the other day to Nightmare on Elm Street 3.
Oh, really?
And I was like, that makes sense.
Okay. Which I haven't seen that Nightmare on Elm Street 3. So.
The Dream Warriors.
Oh, really?
I think that's the one Rennie Harlan directed.
Okay.
So I make posts about this. You're cool going to a theater?
Yes and no. I mean, I have to give like at our station, they're doing everything they can to keep it clean and safe, and I see everybody works at doing that from top to bottom. So I'm hoping the staff and the management will.
I get that. My caveat is I want to use the online booking to see how crowded the theater is, and if it's empty, and I keep having this vibe that I'm going to end up going at the very last show of the day where it's probably the least clean the theater's going to be, and that worries me.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I'm also willing to not go. Like I don't want to be spoiled on Tenet, but at the same time, it still strikes me as weird we're going back.
True, but then again, it's also keep in mind that it seems like a lot of times when I'm at the theater, I'm the only one in the auditorium anyway.
Yeah.
So it may be, I don't have much of a difference in some ways.
So we should get to today's guest, Jonathan Rosenbaum, the esteemed film critic and author. He's one of my heroes. I mean, I have a whole pantheon of film critics that are go-tos, and he's been doing this for quite a while. And he's met some of the met people like Tati and Wells in his career, and it was really fun talking to him because one of the things I started realizing halfway through is how much, I started reading him in high school, and how much of especially my love of Orson Welles comes from some of his writing.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I didn't put two and two together until we were talking today. The other funny thing was all day as we've been leading up to this, he's a great Francophile. He loves French cinema. He lived in Paris for a long time, but he's also just a great ambassador of world cinema. Yeah. And it just brought to me like how much as a viewer I am not.
Well, yeah, but it's we gotta really work at that.
He speaks late in our interview about how that, and he kind of downplays it, but he says something really that I really liked about that's the window into the world. It's funny. I almost threw the Ebert empathy quote, but he was a contemporary of Roger Ebert's, and they're friendly, I assume, but they also probably wrote some contentious stuff against each other too at some points.
Yeah, he shows up has some interesting sound bites in the Roger Ebert documentary.
Yeah. But that's not the full sum of Jonathan Rosenbaum's career.
No, there's a lot of interesting things, and hopefully you'll...
This is the film critic that Jean-Luc Godard said was probably one of his favorite working film critics at one point.
Yep.
So, anyway, onwards with Jonathan Rosenbaum. So I guess let's just go ahead and dive in. I mentioned in our email that placing movies was kind of an influence for the interview portion of this podcast, just because the idea of making a person's biography via the movies in their lives seemed very appealing to people like me and Ted ourselves. I mean, what caused you to want to write that?
Well, it was basically, of course, placing movies was basically designed as a companion volume to Moving Places. So they're both autobiographical in different ways. I don't know quite what else to say about it, but I mean...
Well, let's go ahead into the biography. So your grandfather opened up a series of theaters in Arkansas, right? This would have been at the advent of...
Alabama.
Okay, I thought he started in Arkansas and then you guys moved to Alabama later.
Well, that's right. He was in Arkansas before I was born. I mean, back in the 20s.
Okay.
But then he moved from North Little Rock to Alabama in the 20s. And I think it was in the 20s, or maybe it was in the little before the 20s. Like I know my father remembers going to see Intolerance in North Little Rock, so that helps to date it.
Does he have a story from seeing it? Was it? That's got to be a very loaded movie to see in Little Rock in the 20s.
Well, I guess, but I mean, he was just a kid. My father would have been just 8 years old at the time, or something like that. So, my father was born in 1910. Anyway, and I was born in 1943, so that was a bit later. And actually, I have one of my younger brothers has actually moved back into the town I grew up in and is living there now in Florence.
You lived in a house that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright?
That's right. And in fact, it's become a museum now that's owned by the city. And a very good friend of mine who I co-authored a book with named Murnaz Said Vafa, an Iranian professor and writer and filmmaker, she made a film about the house and about my family, feature length, called A House Is Not a Home, Right or Wrong, which actually fairly recently, I mean, it was a film that basically was just completed earlier and shown first earlier this year.
Just completed. So is it in the limbo right now of the COVID? When is this going to come out type scenario?
Well, it does have a distributor, and it's already shown, and it's already had some public screenings. It's already shown twice in Chicago, and it showed, and we recently showed it online for about 100 architects, which was a very interesting experience. And I showed it once in London, and I showed it once in Zagreb in Croatia earlier this year. So it's slowly making the rounds. I mean, but it's but as I say, she has a distributor now, and I think it's available for people who might want to book it. It's about 70 minutes long, feature length.
Okay, it's available. So the theater that your father took over, but your grandfather owned in Alabama, that was named the Majestic?
Well, no, my father basically went to work for his father until the theaters were sold, which was around 1960 when I was still in high school. And at that point, my father became a professor at the local university for the remainder of his career.
This was in English and American literature? That's
what he taught, yeah.
So were you guys, was it a house that was filled with books and put reading as a top priority?
Well, it is. It still has a lot of books in it, but it's like it's there for decor. It's kind of weird because a lot of the books that I had as a teenager are still in the house. That kind of like went with the deal, So it's like I've probably either gotten replacements for those books or
there's got to be a few you still want to steal somehow.
But there was one that I actually asked to be able to intercept, and they let me take one book back, but.
What was the book?
It was a science fiction book that I can't remember the name of it. Science fiction anthology that I liked a lot as a kid.
So, your parents, were they big into movies then?
They were not. I was really the only real cinephile in the family, except for my grandfather. In a way, enjoyed movies a lot. With my father, it was sort of like they weren't really cinephiles. It was just something that he had to do because it was to make a living. And, it's like we grew up seeing a lot of movies because it was the family business. But I'm the only one that kind of like stuck with as a kind of, something more than just a kind of light entertainment.
Were the movies that were showing during this time just like first run movies during the 50s?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I saw practically everything that came from the Hollywood studios.
But this was would you call this a mom and pop theater chain, an independent chain?
Well, it was actually, they were actually sued by the government for being a kind of monopoly because they had 9 theaters in 4 cities in that part of Alabama, and there were a couple of competitors, but it was sort of like they tended to monopolize a bit, and they also had a partnership for a while with a company in Nashville, a family called the Sudicums. But so I don't know. I think it was sort of like they were forced to become independent because they lost the government lawsuit. And so in fact, during the latter years of the business, they actually showed more independent films and even more art films in that period, because that is what independent theaters did in that time. So I was able to, they were showing, some neorealist films and things like that,
Well, that wasn't my question, because I was wondering if he was showing those foreign films at that time, because you always hear about the theaters owned by the studios. They just show their own product for the most part, whereas the independents would go out of their way to bring in foreign films and more stuff off the beaten path.
Well, they showed a few, but I mean, it's sort of like I wouldn't say I grew up seeing lots of foreign films, but I did see some, including things like The Bicycle Thief and a few others.
How old would you have been when you saw Bicycle Thief?
I wanted to see it on a family trip to New York when I was 7 years old, but it was because 1950. But it was too expensive for the ticket prices for kids, so we went to see Destination Moon instead, and I was very because I wanted to see Bicycle Thief. But then I think it played. If I remember correctly, it eventually showed it at the family theater, maybe a year or two later when I was, maybe 8 years old or something like that.
That's pretty amazing, because most kids would want to see Destination Moon and not Bicycle Thief, and here you're wanting to see Bicycle Thief at your age.
That was just because the plot was described to me, and it seemed to be like I was very moved by the description of the plot by my father.
It involved children somehow, children in peril.
Yeah, right.
So, what were other big highlights for you as movie highlights? How often were you seeing films? Are we talking daily, two a week, one a week, less?
There were 3 movie theaters in town when I was very young, and so I couldn't have seen everything, but I saw an awful lot. I saw almost most things, at least of the new films. So I went on a regular basis. It was kind of like it wasn't so much that I was encouraged by my parents, but it was like a babysitter for them, for me to go to the movies. So when I'd get out of school, I'd go directly to the movie theater.
Do you remember your very first movie?
No, but it was probably one of the Disney films. It might have been Dumbo, might have been Song of the South. I'm not sure which one.
Did you have any movies? I mean, for someone with a taste for Bicycle Thieves at 7, it seems like you're already into something more sophisticated a little early. But when you're teenage years,
not necessarily. No, my favorite movie when I was very young was Annie, Get Your Gun, and that was also 1950. The musical with Betty Hutton.
When puberty hit, what movies were you getting interested in?
Oh, I don't know. East of Eden was a kind of a film I related to a lot more than Rebel Without a Cause. Although I saw both, but yeah, I mean, I was responded a lot to Elia Kazan movies as a teenager. Like Facing the Crowd had a big impact on me. I only really discovered Orson Welles later, after I went away to school and I saw Citizen Kane when I was about 17 or something.
I was going to ask, what was your first Orson Welles movie? So where did you see it? Do you remember?
The first Orson Welles movie was probably either Othello on TV, which had a big impact, or Touch of Evil, which was playing at the Competitors Theater, but which didn't mean much to me at the time. To me, it was just a thriller. It didn't have any special meaning or impact for me then.
So when you went to college, you went initially to college, you had plans to write novels at that point, or just literature?
I wrote my first novel when I was still a senior in high school at a boarding school in Vermont, actually. And I started, to get interested in film as an art form around the same time when I went away to school, because that was the beginnings of, things like the New Wave and so on, where I saw movies like Shadows and Breathless and 400 Blows, Shoot the Piano Player, things like that, on Hiroshima Mon Amour. And I would see those like in New York, usually on my way up to school or on spring break or on Christmas break, or, I had grandparents in New York City. My mother was a New Yorker originally, from New York. So I had relatives in New York. And it was because of, seeing a lot of the films, a lot of it from the New Wave at that time, that really got me interested in film as an art form, I would say.
Do you remember the theater you were seeing these movies in New York?
Oh, I don't know. There was one on, there was a theater on 8th Street where I saw La Ventura. I saw last year at Marienbad at the Carnegie Hall Cinema. I saw a lot of films at the Bleecker Street Cinema. I went to a lot of films at the New Yorker Theater, which was on 88th and Broadway. I also went to a lot of films at a theater that existed then called the Charles, which was on around, I can't remember, it was 10th or 12th Street and Avenue B, I think, or something like that. Okay. I had to walk east because I lived I started college at New York University. And so I was basically living on the West Village and sometimes walking to the East Village to go to the Charles.
See, on Wikipedia it has you going to Bard, but you went to NYU first, or you just exclusively?
Yeah, for the first 3 semesters. And I basically was a bit alienated by NYU because I much prefer the idea of a community sort of college. So I transferred to Bard, and really Bard was wonderful. It was, I would say, just about the only part of my education that I really liked. I liked it so much that I spent, I wound up spending 5 years as an undergraduate. I spent an extra semester because, I didn't, in terms of transferring credit, so I spent 5 years as an undergraduate.
Did you learn French in high school or in college, or where did you first learn French?
I started taking French in high school and didn't do very well. Tried in college, didn't do very well. Even when I moved to Paris, I've never learned French very well. It's a kind of disability, I'm sorry to say.
You've translated books and you still have trouble with...
I translated one book, but I did get an awful lot of help on it. And, and I put in a lot of extra time, and I was lucky enough in London when I was translating this book by Andre Bazin, Orson Welles, to be sharing an apartment with Tom Milne, who was an excellent translator, who went over everything I did and corrected it and, improved it and everything. So I did do some translation with great difficulty, but I would say I was better at, sort of like reading French than I've always been in speaking French.
That makes sense. So wait, when did you go over to France?
The first time I went was when I was in graduate school, which would have been around 66, I guess, or something like that.
So you were in Paris in 68?
I wasn't there in May 68, but I arrived in June 68.
Okay.
So there was still tear gas. They were basically repaving some of the streets where they dug up the cobblestones. And, there was still a lot going on that summer. And that was when I decided I wanted to move to Paris. And I moved to Paris in the fall of 69 after spending the summer there in 68.
This would have been after grad school?
Yeah, I quit graduate school. Basically, I stayed in graduate school until I was old enough for whatever reason. Because I was from Alabama, there were a lot of people enlisting. I knew I wouldn't be drafted. So I was draft dodging, for the last part when I was in graduate school.
Bravo
to you.
When
I knew I wasn't going to be drafted, I quit graduate school and moved to Paris.
I guess where exactly did the film writing in France start to come into play? Where did you first start writing for film magazines and once you were in France?
Even before I moved to Paris, I edited an anthology of film criticism that for various complicated reasons never came out, although it twice made its way into galley proofs. So, I did a lot of work. And it's how I got involved in film criticism, because I met a lot of critics while editing the book and, and met a lot of people in early travels, like I met the people at Sight and Sound, for example, when I went to London for what was probably the first time. So early on, after I moved to Paris, I contacted the people at Film Comment asking if they wanted a Paris correspondent. And they said, well, try writing something for us and we'll see if we like it. And they liked it. So starting in about 71, 2 years after I moved, I started writing for Film Comment. And around 72 or 73, I started writing for Sight and Sound also.
Was the Film Comment the Raising Cain essay?
I think the first thing I wrote for them was a Paris journal. And then the second thing was, although maybe it was the first that I wrote, my attack on Raising Cain.
Did you get hooked up with the Cahiers du Cinema crowd when you were over in Paris?
Not really. I'm trying to think who I might have known. I actually knew one person who was actually affiliated later with the Cahiers. The first time I ever went to Paris, I met somebody named Bernard Eisenschitz, who I still know, who's a major historian. He wrote a book that's in English about Nicholas Ray, a very detailed biography of Nicholas Ray. So he was connected, but at the time, I think at a certain point towards the end of my stay in Paris, I started to know some of the writers there. And I also got to know, during the time I was in Paris, the editor of Positif, Michel Simon.
Oh, okay.
So I read gradually, but during the first 2 or 3 years I was in Paris, I was very isolated and didn't know people very much. And in fact, almost all the people I knew were not French people, but other foreigners. I mean, Americans, English, people from Latin America, actually, Cubans and Argentinians. Those were the people who were my friends, basically, during most of the time I was in Paris. Now I have a lot of friends there, more friends than I did then, and including several French people, but I didn't back then.
During this isolated time, what movies were you seeing in Paris?
Oh, God, all sorts of things. I mean, it was in Paris that I discovered Playtime. I don't know. I also rediscovered American cinema, including films that I'd seen when I was younger, but which I kind of was very much influenced by French criticism. So I kind of had a kind of critical discovery of people like Howard Hawks and Samuel Fuller and, the kind of people I'd already started coming interested in the United States by reading Andrew Sarris and so on. Nicholas Ray, people like that.
Speaking of Playtime, how did you get hooked up with Jacques Tati?
Let's see. Well, I was Playtime was, became my favorite film. And my mother happened to find out that an assistant to Tati who came from Birmingham, actually, grew up in Birmingham, who was French-American. And so she got me in touch with her, and through her I was able to set up an interview with Tati. And I hit it off well with Tati when I interviewed him, and I also became friends with his assistant, who hired me to even write the sort of voiceover for a documentary that she'd made. So basically, because of hitting it off well with Tati and also becoming friends with her, I wound up getting invited maybe a couple of months later to be what was called his script consultant, which was really just being his audience. Because he liked to bounce his ideas off of other people. And I did that for not a real long time, but it was a wonderful experience. And I was even paid a salary for it. It was for a week or two, basically.
Oh, okay. On Wikipedia, it has you mentioned as an extra in a Bresson movie.
That's right. During the same period, in fact, practically the first piece I ever wrote about film, it's not a very good piece, but it's on my website, is a piece that I wrote for the Village Voice about being an extra on 4 Nights of a Dreamer, called 2 Nights of an Extra. And it was just because when I was going to the Cinematheque one night, I was actually watching Otto Preminger's Advice and Consent. And as I was leaving the theater, somebody came up to me and said, "Would you like to be an extra in a Bresson film?" And I said, "Sure." And they were shooting a few blocks away. So I went there and was there for several hours. And then I became friends with an assistant on the film, an Indian woman, actually. And she told me about where they were shooting the next night, which was the last night of shooting. So it was the last 2 nights of shooting I was around for.
Was that one of your first productions you'd ever been around?
One that I was around for very long, for any length of time, yeah, probably. And what was really funny is that most of the extras didn't even know who Bresson was or that he was directing the film. They thought his wife, who was the assistant director, was the one who was directing, And a lot of people on the crew didn't even have a sense of who Bresson was. It was really strange. Some of them knew, but some of them didn't.
The stereotype I would have of being an extra on a Bresson movie would be a statue times 10. What was it like?
Well, it was, I hadn't been at that point an extra on any other film, so I didn't have anything to compare it to.
Fair enough.
But I mean, Bresson's form of direction was he'd say, plus lentement, walk more slowly, he would say to people. And then there was one person who walked fast. He said, "Oh, you like to walk fast. Okay, you walk fast." So, I mean, it's fairly, straightforward stuff.
It's just funny because I've worked for multiple directors who have cited Bresson, mainly because of the book he had written. But I did want to come back to, you were writing for Film Comment, Sight and Sound, and Village Voice in the 70s. That's correct, right?
That's right. I was also reviewing books for the Village Voice. I reviewed Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow for the Village Voice during that period, too.
You wrote the Gravity's Rainbow review for the Village Voice. That's got to be a very poured over review.
Well, it was the thing is, I had already been a fan of his two earlier novels when I was back in the States, so I had asked to review it. And at the time he wasn't famous enough or whatever, I was the first person who asked. And so I got the assignment. It was a very difficult book to review, and I spent a long time on it. I ever wrote for Sight and Sound was a review of Godard's collected criticism, actually, which was very challenging also, which had been translated by Tom Mill, who later became my flatmate when I lived in London.
I guess I wanted to know what it was like, because I know people in my generation think in Pollyannish terms about film culture in the 70s, late 60s, it being, for lack of a better term, water cooler. It was essential to the culture at the time, and in ways that it just isn't anymore.
No, but I think people tend to glamorize it in ways that are sometimes not justifiable, because they kept thinking, okay, it was great in the 60s and 70s. All these great Godard films were opening. But, in the States, they were all, and in fact, in France, largely too, they were closing within a few days, and they were attacked by most of the critics. And it wasn't like, I don't know, you see, I think film going was social then in a different way from the way it's social now. But I think it's just as social now. It's just that people are more social on the internet now, and through things like this podcast and through websites and through email and through Facebook and all of this, So, I actually have a website in which I get about 1,000 people that visits every day. And that becomes very social, because even though I don't have people can't post on it, I do get lots of reactions and feedback, like on Facebook and so on. But I don't see films at the same time and in the same places as other people. So it's social in a different way. But for me, it's just as social. And in fact, in some ways, it's even better, because when I was seeing a lot of these great films, like in New York and Paris, sometimes weeks would go by or even months before I'd run into somebody else who'd seen the same films. Whereas now you can go on the internet right away and interact with people about it and discuss it. So I think even though there were a lot of exciting films that were coming out in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of arguing about them. It wasn't like everybody was in agreement about things then. Just as many people hated Godard then, or even more people hated Godard then that hate him now. More people don't even know who Godard is probably today. But I'm thinking about the New Wave a lot, because I'm getting ready to teach a course in Agnes Varda in a few days in Chicago online. The first time I'll be teaching online.
They got that new box set coming out, right?
Oh, it's already out.
Oh, it's already out.
The Criterion box set out.
That's a fair point. I guess in my head, the romanticism comes from something really basic of legacy media and people arguing legacy media. And when I look at the archives, I see that. But I can see how that's really trite and meaningless compared to the community on the internet. And so,
the thing is, younger people can actually, I, on a regular basis, run across or meet online or even in person people in their 20s who know more about film than I possibly could have known at that age, even though I was living in New York and Paris and London. So it seems to me that there's a kind of like possibilities now for film goers that didn't exist back in the 60s and 70s. You'd wait for a film to turn up, and then if it, and of course Paris, major reason why I moved to Paris was because I like to see films, and I could see more films there. But even so, it was sort of like you didn't own films, and you didn't have them at home the way you do now, where you could access them whenever you wanted to. So it was a different kind of culture for that reason.
So you sounded pretty positive about the landscape today when you hear, because it seems like old school film fans or old school critics where, they're kind of poo-pooing it, and theater going is going, not the way it used to be, and nobody knows the sense of history, but you seem to be very proactive and positive about what's going on right now.
I know, but I'm different from most of the people my own age. I mean, most of the people I know who are contemporaries of mine tend to be very negative about it. But I feel like I'm a beneficiary of the current culture because of my website, because, in other words, I owe a lot to the internet.
Well, I love your, one of my favorite things is your column in CinemaScope. It's a must read, and it really helps me out to find some obscure stuff, and then I can get it. It's amazing, because I'm 15 years younger than you, and I still can remember, if you didn't see a film or you didn't have a campus nearby, you may not see that film forever or once a year if you're lucky. And now
Yeah.
it's all here at our fingertips. You turned me on to getting that disc of Sternberg's first film, Joseph von Sternberg.
The Salvation Hunters.
Yeah, it's that fantastic disc, and I can't believe we actually had access to that now.
Well, of course, there's still an awful lot of Americans who don't even know that to get sort of European discs, you need to have a multi-regional, all of that kind of stuff. I have friends who are very sophisticated about film, but still haven't figured out that it's worth having a multi-regional DVD player.
Right.
The reason why I started doing that column partly was in order to get a lot of free DVD.
Of course, but it's great because it really does. It's very beneficial for us fans out here. I can attest to it.
I just got in the mail recently a couple of things I really love. One is a double disc set that has two of my two favorite Albert Lewin films, Pandora and the Flying Dutchman and The Living Idol. And The Living Idol doesn't have much of a reputation, but in fact, when I was in Paris, a Cuban friend of mine, Carlos Clarence, who'd been very adopted by Henri Langlois, told me that Henri Langlois' favorite film was The Living Idol, the last film of Albert Lewin.
Wow. Okay.
Which kind of blew my mind because even people who like Lewin, most of them don't like this film. It's a very strange film, shot in Mexico City. And it's shot largely on the campus of the University of Mexico City, which is the largest university in the world, by the way. Has the largest campus, at least, I think.
This double disc was it's a foreign release or American release?
No, it's American. Coen Brothers. It's Coen Brothers.
Oh, Coen. Okay, Coen Media. Okay.
Yeah, Coen Media, right. And I also got, a film that I'm sort of curious to see now. I didn't like it so much when it came out because he wasn't, like an approved auteur. But Joseph Strick's movie of The Balcony, I'm very curious about. The Jean Genet play.
Okay.
It's to that with Shelley Winters and Lee Grant and Peter Falk. So I don't know. I'm very curious to see it again in black and white scope, actually.
Cool.
So when did you move to London?
I moved to London. What basically happened was, when I moved to Paris, I was living on an inheritance from my grandfather. And the money that I inherited, which, also paid for my education, it kind of ran out halfway through my stay in Paris. And so I was finding it harder and harder to make a living. I was getting what other jobs I could, which included some things like script translation, because I was doing it, with great difficulty, but I was getting whatever jobs I could get. But there weren't that many. But at the same time, there was a job that I was offered as assistant editor at Monthly Film Bulletin, put out by the British Film Institute, which also published Sight and Sound. So that was a steady income. So even though I preferred Paris to London, and still do, actually, I couldn't turn down a job like that. So I moved to London. And it was actually in 1974, after 5 years. And I stayed in London for 2.5 years.
So did you become more involved with Sight and Sound at that point, or is this strictly just the other?
Well, I had been involved with, I'd been writing a lot for Sight and Sound, but once I got the job, I was actually on the editorial board of Sight and Sound as assistant editor of Monthly Film Bulletin. So I was working on both magazines.
When did the opportunity to go to San Diego to teach at the University of California?
What happened was I was starting to feel homesick for the States. And also, I still had kind of like some literary ambitions as a writer. And somehow I felt I was losing contact with American speech. And, so I was thinking maybe I can get a job teaching film in the States. So I started sending off a few letters to a few people, including Manny Farber, who I dealt with briefly because even though I hadn't met him face to face, we'd had some phone conversations because of that anthology I edited, which never came out. And then to my amazement, he wrote me back offering me a job replacing him while he was taking off on a Guggenheim grant. So it was only a job for 2 quarters. And so it was a big risk because I was moving everything there and I didn't have any guarantee of a future job after that. But I thought, hey, I can't do better than replacing Manny Farber. So I moved all my stuff and as it turned out, I wasn't rehired. I went over very badly with his students, partly because I hadn't had hardly any experience teaching then, but also his style of teaching was not something I was accustomed to doing.
What were you teaching?
Well, he was basically giving large lecture courses, which were almost like improvised jazz solos. I mean, they were improvised, and they were very interesting, but it just wasn't kind of like something I was used to doing. And also, I was kind of like expected, almost in a weird sort of way, to be, well, I don't know if you could say to be an imitation Manny Farber. I don't think he literally wanted necessarily, but I found that when I was teaching a criticism seminar, that all the students were trying to imitate him in writing, which was disastrous, because he's a terrible person to try to imitate, even though I think he's the greatest American film critic. So as it turned out, after 2 semesters, I wasn't rehired. But luckily, I applied for a art history grant from the National Endowment of the Arts, was giving art history grants in film. And so I got a $5,000 grant, which enabled me to start work on Moving Places, my first book.
Did you apply as a film writer, or did you apply with the project of the book specifically?
Well, at the time that I applied, I thought it was going to be a nonfiction book about my family's theater business, but I didn't really think about it anymore because I didn't even think I was going to necessarily get it. And then when I got it, suddenly a more radical book kind of came together in my head. So I wrote the first part of it when I was still in Del Mar, a suburb of San Diego. Then I moved to New York for a year. Then I moved from New York to Hoboken, where I was living with a film professor who was finishing her dissertation at the time, named Sandy Flitterman, now Sandy Flitterman Lewis, who teaches at Rutgers. So eventually it worked out for me, but I had about 10 years in the wilderness, because even though I had that grant, and years later I got a Guggenheim grant, but that was many years later, and for about 10 years I was having a rough time basically supporting myself as a freelancer, and I couldn't get even year-long contracts. I could only get sort of like be hired on a semester by semester basis at NYU, then at School of Visual Arts, then later at Berkeley for 1 semester, then I went to Santa Barbara for 4 years, and all of that was having difficulty supporting myself until I got hired by the Chicago Reader.
And so freelance gigs were just kind of hit or miss in that period of time, writing-wise?
Well, I was writing freelance pieces when I could, but basically, as I say, it was frustrating because the people who were deciding whether I'd be hired or not hired were people who knew less about film than I did, by and large. And they were people, even today, I don't take seriously as film people, but they were also decided I didn't have the right degrees, I couldn't have any job security. And then I was actually approached about teaching at the Chicago Reader. I mean, actually, the last year I think I was in Santa Barbara, I had a year-long contract. And around that time, I was approached about working for the Chicago Reader, and I said, could you offer me a year's contract? And they said no. So I said, well, why don't you come back to me in another year and see if you're still looking for somebody? And so they were still looking a year later, and I applied and got it. All thanks to Dave Kerr, who recommended me as his replacement when he left the Chicago Reader.
I don't exactly want to completely leave the academic writing behind, just because one of the things I found that has been noted about your writing is this bridge between kind of daily film criticism and academia. You kind of your style kind of bridges the gap between the two. Do you think that's fair?
Yes, and I mean, I think I'm probably unusual in the sense that most of my, let's say, journalistic colleagues don't keep up with film academia. And I did try to keep up to a point. And also I have friends. One of my best friends is Jim Nairmore, who's one of my favorite academic film critics.
Yeah, he's teacher at IU, a professor. And one of the most, what would you say, one of the better Wells books? That's
the best. I think
the best
in English. Also, the best book he's written the best book on film noir. He's written the best book on Stanley Kubrick. And the best book I know on film acting, all of those.
Yeah, he came down to talk. I went to University of Evansville, and they actually had him come down and talk. And I had that one, I don't know what that one journal was, where it was all dedicated to Wells, and had a Nairmore article in it. And he was really surprised and impressed that I knew who he was. And I said, could you sign this? And I was all excited, because I've been flirting with film criticism since I was in grade school off and on. And so I was very aware of his name and some of his credentials at the time. And but yeah, we were trying to we were discussing this earlier about how, you seem to be really in that little slipstream between, the weekly Consumer Report type stuff and then the academic stuff, where you seem to bridge the gap. A really nice little valley there.
Well, I think a lot of my career could be described as trying to sort of fill in gaps because, I mean, I started out wanting to be a novelist and short fiction writer. And so I studied literature. So there's ways in which I'm sort of like trying to combine my literary background with my film background. And then also the fact that I came from Alabama and then I wound up spending 8 years in Europe. There are different things that are kind of isolated from each other in my life. And so my writing is an attempt to bring them all together in different ways, I guess. That's a point that actually Jim Nairmore made when he wrote about me in his collection of his film pieces, An Invention Without a Future. By the way, he's writing a book now about Cary Grant, which should be really interesting.
Let's backtrack for a second. I want to know where and when. I just want to ask you on a personal level, your meeting with Orson Welles.
Actually, that was my next question.
That was when I was in Paris.
How'd that come about?
And in fact, it was early on because what happened was a person I mentioned earlier was a friend, Carlos Clarence, a Cuban, happened to have a script of Heart of Darkness, which was Wells' first film script, which was the film he wanted to make before Citizen Kane at RKO. And I was writing a lengthy piece about it for Film Comment. And someone said, you ought to ask Wells about it. And I said, well, he's not going to want me to, I wouldn't be able to interview him. And he said, why don't you try? So I found out that he had a secretary in London. So I called his secretary in London, and she gave me the address of a film studio, of a editing studio where he was editing what turned out was F for Fake before it was called F for Fake. And they said, why don't you write him a letter there, but don't call him up. He's busy. Don't pester him. So I wrote him a letter. And it was towards the end of my work on the article, actually. I thought the article was practically all done, but I thought, well, why don't I write him anyway? And I wrote a fairly modest letter, although I did mention in passing in it that I had written an attack on Pauline Kael's and asking him a few questions about the casting and so on. And the amazing thing, this is a tribute to the French postal system. I mailed the letter to him on a Saturday afternoon. And then because I didn't think I was going to get an answer, I stayed up all night, Sunday night, finishing a whole draft of the article, and didn't get to sleep until 7 o'clock in the morning. So I went to sleep at 7 o'clock. 2 hours later, the phone wakes me up, and someone said, this is an assistant of Orson Welles. Mr. Welles was wondering if you'd like to have lunch with him today.
Oh, my gosh.
And the place that he proposed meeting me for lunch was walking distance from where I lived, which was at a restaurant that actually you see in F for Fake called Mediterranean, a great seafood restaurant in the left bank. So very sleep deprived. 3 hours later, because it was at noon, I met Wells for lunch. I didn't bring a tape recorder because I was so afraid I was going to be so nervous that I was bound to spill my wine or something. So I didn't trust myself around a tape recorder. So that's how I met him. And the first thing I said to him was that I was amazed that he had invited me to lunch. And he said, well, I don't have time to answer your letter. That was his explanation.
So was he everything that we kind of perceive him to be when you met him? Or
well, I'll tell you this, that I thought before I met him that there was anybody in the world I most wanted to be, it was Orson Welles. And then after meeting him, I didn't feel that way. Because what we were dealing with was films he wanted to make and couldn't make. And so it seemed like I got the feeling that it was very difficult to be Orson Welles. He was nice. And also I think he was being very honest. But, well, it was funny. He was very self-absorbed, but he was aware of the fact that he was self-absorbed and tried to compensate for it. Like it was very clear when I let drop at some point about, that I grew up in the movie business and my family were exhibitor. He didn't have the slightest bit of interest in that. And so I had quickly changed the subject.
Right. So, when I read all the guys that have done so much work on Wells, it just seems so frustrating, especially in those latter days where just nobody wants to pony up the money for him. I mean, and people that had pocket change that could just say, yeah, here's some dough. Why did that never happen?
Well, I think there were different reasons. Part of it had to do with the fact that he would freak people out in one way or another, partly because he was very bad with middle management. He was great with, he was friends with the studio heads, but when it came to dealing with other people, I think could be very disdainful and insulting. And I think that that's probably what led to his problems on Touch of Evil, for example. I suspect. I'm just guessing. I don't actually know, but I think it's sort of like my sense of him comes not just from him, but from people who were close to him. Because, I'm friends with is actually one of his main collaborators, Oja Kadar, who was his mistress for the last 20-odd years of his life.
Speaking of which, what's your personal, unless you don't want to say, but the final, the other side of the wind, were you and Oja
which you were consulted on?
Yeah, were you guys happy with that?
Well, yeah, we were both consulted on it. Oja she fought for so many years to trying to get it made, and I think it's a very sensitive matter for her. But I was one of the two consultants. Joe McBride was the other. But my function was largely to try to represent her point of view as much as I understood it. And I think she trusted me to be a kind of her representative to a certain extent. I've written about my whole, feelings about, because, there were certain things as a consultant that I didn't succeed in convincing the others to, suggestions that they didn't follow. But I've written about it in my most recent book, actually. It's called The Other Side of the Argument. It's also on my website, a lengthy piece about the other side of the argument.
Well, I was just thinking, because Ted and I watched the other making behind-the-scenes documentary on there, and it said there was like 3-hour assembly, 4-hour assembly. And as an editor, I know that like getting an assembly down to running time is the art of editing in itself. It just seems like if Wells isn't there, that like there's got to be an exactitude about it that's hard to gain.
Well, I don't think there's a problem about the running time of the film, at least for me. I have problems or issues with the sound editing, which I think was edited like a Hollywood movie, and it's an anti-Hollywood movie.
Do you have some examples? Because I remember when I saw it in a theater. I was able to see it in the theater, and I remember thinking that it was interesting to see Wells with modern sound ADR. But like you said, that's an interesting perspective, anti-Hollywood movie.
Well, I do think that, for example, there was the sequence of the gay baiting with the school teacher. I actually thought was much more powerful when I originally saw it, where it didn't have any music in the background. And I thought putting the music in the background was a distraction, and it softened it. And I thought it was much more intimidating. It's the scene that's seen properly. It really makes you squirm. It's a very uncomfortable scene. You don't know whose side you're on. It's like you feel very embarrassed for both of the characters. And anyway, it just seemed crazy to have this sort of tinkling piano music in another room, So I tried to get them to cut it out, and they said it didn't work. Now, why is it doesn't work? Because they're thinking of continuity cutting with sound, which is totally contrary to the way that Wells thought about sound. His use of sound in a lot of his late works is alienating one, even spatially, from certain things. It's not about that type of, Hollywood continuity. But, like all the people who worked on the editing, and of course that was part of the problem. It was edited by a committee, not by one person.
It was Bob Murkowski who was the editor on it, right?
Yeah, well, he was. I thought he had the right impulses, and I spent a whole afternoon with Joe McBride talking to him about different things. But the point is that there was Bogdanovich, there was Frank Marshall, who's nothing if not a Hollywood person. And so between him and Peter Bogdanovich and John Riesma, who was the only person without a Hollywood background who worked on that, who was actually the real producer. But the point is he was just one among several voices. So Oja really was sort of like she was able to alert them to certain things that had been left out of the rough cut, that they were able to bring back in. But she's actually hasn't even seen the final film. I think it's too hard for her to deal with it.
Interesting.
No, it makes sense. I did want to ask you about your involvement with This Is Orson Welles.
Yes.
It seems like Bogdanovich was trying to make his own Hitchcock Truffaut. Was that an original aim, or was that... Your face says no on that.
Well, it's a complicated thing because, first of all, the reason why I was the editor of it was because Oja asked me to. Oja was the one who got the rights to the book. Wells willed them to her. And so I was left alone to do it as I wanted to until the final editing on the book, in which there were some political correctness cuts that Peter Bogdanovich insisted on, which I disagreed with. But he was able to have the final word. And even the editor at HarperCollins was on my side and thought they should be kept. But he didn't want to offend, I don't know, John Wayne's relatives, or he didn't want to allow Wells to use the word Negro in 1969, or he didn't want to, and he said Wells himself, if he were alive, would have made these changes, and maybe so, but I thought it would have been much better if they'd kept the original. He called Joseph von Sternberg the king and queen of camp, and Peter wouldn't permit that. Or calling John Wayne a fascist, or saying something that was critical of Israel. But anyway, these were fairly minor. For the most part, the main problem I had was that I wanted the book to be longer. I had to cut the manuscript.
Wow. And
the main thing that was cut, which I objected to the most, was the Touch of Evil memo.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It got, on the second edition, when it came out in paperback, I finally was able to persuade them to publish, at that point, not even the whole memo, but 2/3 of it, which was all I had access to at that point. Later, I was able to lead Universal to where the complete memo was, but they wouldn't allow me. This is how stupid the studios are. They wouldn't allow me to read the whole memo until I signed an agreement swearing that I wouldn't reveal the existence of this memo to anyone, completely ignoring the fact that I had already published 2/3 of the memo in English and French.
I was confused because I think my version has the memo, and it also has the Magnificent Ambersons continuity in it. Am I misremembering this?
Yeah, they kept that, but the original edition cut the Touch of Evil memo, and then it got restored in the paperback edition that came out.
And it's on like every Blu-ray copy of the movie right now, the full memo.
But actually, even though that version is not as complete as what you can get on the 3-disc set, which has the complete memo included on it. And I'll tell you something funny. It's just telling you about studio thinking. They hired me to write the introduction to the memo, and they said that I had to use the term restoration. And I said, but it's not a restoration. And they said, well, yeah, but you have to use the term restoration. So I said, what about if I put the term in quotation marks? Oh, no problem. So the term restoration it had to be there, even though it's not a restoration.
What term did they object to?
I objected to restoration because it's not a restoration. Restoration is bringing something back to the way it was. And
what were you trying to write it as initially that they had you replace it as with restoration? What term were you initially trying to use that they objected to?
Well, I didn't have another term. I think it was, but it wasn't that they objected to my term. That they also I think wanted to use the term sometimes as director's cut, which of course is ridiculous with Touch, because he never had director's cut,
right.
Like on Touch of Evil. But yeah, I mean, these are sales terms. They don't even think about whether they're, it's like the way our president thinks about, it's not about it's about whether you sell things. It's not about whether it's true or false. They're not concerned with that. It's just about whether you get people's attention and get them to shell out money. That's all.
Kind of leads into making your canon, as opposed to the canons that the AFI and everybody else wants to shove down us, and then you came up with your response, which was pretty fascinating.
I did want to mention, so being the youngest here, obviously, I first came across you in high school with Movie Wars, which I think is one of your more popular books. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it is my most popular book. And oddly enough, it was a book that because it was a small publisher, had no advertising budget at all. Like, they didn't place any ads. The book had a publicist, and I never even met her. But nonetheless, this book received over 100 reviews. It was a runaway popular success.
What appealed to someone like me would have been, I just remember a certain part of the thesis being in a small town. The idea that the studios were controlling which movies we got to see at the time I was really angry at the time. And it's funny, leading to this interview, I reread your Small Soldiers piece, which I hadn't read in years. And it was funny because I worked in a movie theater in my teen years too. And I remember working when Small Soldiers came out and reading your piece well after Small Soldiers had left the theater.
Yeah. Well, it was, the piece I wrote on my sort of 100 favorite American films was the most popular piece I ever published in the Chicago Reader. And of course, people are very favorable towards lists now because I think they have so much to choose from. So I think that had something to do with the popularity of both that piece and the book as a whole.
And you've done these lists. Are you still fine with lists? Do you mind that? Because I know some old school critics and film fans say, oh, they can't stand them.
No, I think they're very useful.
Okay.
And so no, I still believe in them. And when I was first getting interested in film, the first film magazine I ever bought was Sight and Sound. It was in 1961, I think, or 62, and it had the poll that they do every 10 years of critics picking their 10 favorite films. And I used that as my guide for the films I wanted to see, various critics' lists. I used that as a kind of guide to teaching myself about the art of film. So from the very beginning, it was a very important learning tool for me.
So what do you think about, keeping with new things that are happening, what do you think about streaming versus, hard copies? I'm an old school hoarder. I have, just tons and tons, and I don't even have internet at my home. I'm at Shane's house with the internet, but I just love, getting the new Criterion or getting the stuff, or seeing your column and ordering stuff. Streaming, I just don't see it's for me. What do you think about the future of that?
I don't have any problem with it, but it's sort of like, sometimes obviously certain films, if you don't see them on a big screen, they suffer, you have problems with them. I just finished writing an article for the Biennale, this wonderful film festival in Vienna, about Kelly Reichardt. And I did see Poor Cow for the first time on a big screen. I was lucky enough because, just before the pandemic, I got to see it. But when I had to see it again to write my article, I had to see it on streaming. And, there's a lot of scenes, and in fact, in all of her films that are sort of, filmed in the dark, and it's very hard to make out details and to tell what's going on if you're just looking at them on your laptop, which is how I was seeing it. So the film suffered for me because I couldn't see it on a big screen. Or at least I don't know, you could say it suffered. I suffered because I couldn't follow a lot of details.
The problem I have with any kind of, I've been trying to read Paul Schrader's Transcendental Cinema book right now. And one of the problems I have with slow cinema in general at home is the ability to pause. I need someone to control the projector, not let me be able to pause. Otherwise the impulse is going to be there, especially when something gets uncomfortable or I have any excuse to go to the bathroom or snack or something.
I don't know. I do miss sort of theatrical screenings in certain ways, but at the same time, I love the idea of being able to possess a film the way you possess a book, and you can go back to favorite passages and things like that. So that, for me, makes up for some of the other losses some of the times.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I it's funny because I was going through a bunch of your books today, and I found a passage you wrote, I want to say it's the beginning of Movies as Politics. You wrote something about the apocalyptic end of cinema, and everyone of your friends are talking about this. And this book came out in 95, and you're like, this came from the Rotterdam Film Festival in 1985. Then in Goodbye Cinema, Hello Cinephilia, there was a passage in there that I was reading, and I wasn't dating, but it just sounds like it could have been written yesterday about the art of buying a ticket and going to see a movie with a crowd of people who also bought a ticket is not what the majority of people are dealing with anymore. But at the same time, this reoccurs throughout a lot of your writing. I totally agree with you. Like, we're still in a better area where we have access to all these movies that have been lost for over a century.
Well, I think there's also, through the whole history of cinema, it's always been in a state of evolution. It's never stayed the same. I mean, there was silent films, followed by talkies. There was black and white, followed by color. There was Academy ratio, succeeded by different widescreen formats. I mean, the point is it's all been changed. It's been a series of changes. And seeing it on a TV screen obviously makes a lot of changes. And some of the changes have been harmful, but it's very hard to sort of posit, like one point of film history when everything was perfect and not changing. It's always been changing in certain ways. It's the point I'm trying to make, really.
I did want to ask, what led to leaving the Chicago Reader?
Well, I'd been there for 20 years. I think I have to admit that part of it had to do with the fact that when I started at the Chicago Reader, I had literally unlimited length and a certain type of actually freedom that I don't think anybody else writing about film had, because in other words, I was able to write about films 6 months after they opened if they were still playing in Chicago. But by the time I left, I didn't have unlimited length. It was restricted in terms of length. I had to write about films when they opened. It was like all these things. In other words, it became like everybody else, you know? And I also didn't like the way the reader was changing. They fired all their political writers, which I thought was crazy. It's sort of like what the reader should have stuck to was whatever it did best and other papers didn't do. Instead, they decided to become like mainstream. In other words, there used to be a feature, maybe they still have it. It says what the reader is reading, and, you know, they talk about. At a certain point, everything the reader was reading was mainstream. It wasn't alternative press at all. So I just thought, you know, if the reader is competing with Time Magazine, they're going to lose because Time Magazine has more means. So what's the point of competing with Time Magazine?
That makes sense.
The whole point of an alternative press is do things that the mainstream press isn't doing, which I was doing. And you see, I think there's a change, another change the reader went through, which I didn't feel great about, was that it went from being a writer's newspaper to being an editor's newspaper. And that literally happened. I mean, you know, at a certain point, my office was on the same floor as the editors, and then I was moved upstairs because they wanted to have all the editors together, and they wouldn't allow me to edit other people's copy, which I would have liked to have been able to be an editor too. But that was secondary. It was the fact that basically they took the position that any text that I turned in would have to be edited and that it would always be improved. And I was saying that's very alienating to writers because, you know, if you really work hard on something, you get to the point where you think this can't be improved. This is as good as it can get. But if they feel committed to always changing something, it's demoralizing to writers to take that position.
Well, you definitely saw the tea leaves in regards to weeklies, but I was in a position, Ted had to disabuse me of this, but when you left the Reader, I thought you were retired from film criticism altogether. I haven't read a lot of the pieces you've written in the last few years on your website until more recently.
Well, no, I've been writing just as much in a lot of ways. And the thing that I'm really I was really fortunate about is because of my website, I have control over all the pieces, even though they're legally owned by the Reader. If I don't like the way I was edited on a particular piece, I could go back to, if I still have a copy of my original version, I can run that piece on my website, which is really great because that was something the people who gave me the website gave me that power, which is great. But I think in any case that I basically wanted to have the freedom to choose what I was doing. I think part of the trouble when you review everything that comes along, and you have to review everything, or, you know, is that most of the films I was seeing were films I wouldn't have chosen to see on my own. You know, it became alienated labor, and it was alienated labor for much of the time. People ask me sometimes if I've seen such and such a film. I don't even remember unless I look it up on my website, and then sometimes I read my own review, and I still can't remember the film. The point of what's alienating about being a regular reviewer is that you have to sort of like make everything seem important the week it comes out, but then you're supposed to forget about it a week later, you know, to make room for the next film that's supposed to be important. And so that there's a kind of false position you have to assume in doing that. So I think that it's back to being a freelancer gives me the freedom to choose my subjects, and, you know.
This kind of ties into this quote you just did a recent interview where you said, if you're independent of the mainstream, you can brand yourself, but if you're in the mainstream, it's the mainstream that brands you.
Absolutely. That's why I'm not happy with the piece I wrote about Bergman for the New York Times, you know, which,
Did you write that headline?
Oh, I did not, and I hated that headline, you know. But in fact, I had to rewrite the piece 3 times, you know, before the editor accepted it. You know, I wanted to write something that was more favorable to Bergman, that dealt with him as a theater director, for example. You know, so it was their piece. It wasn't my piece, you know. That's the trouble. If you write a piece at least if I wrote a piece for the New York Times, it's not my piece, it's their piece. And the same thing would happen if I were writing probably for the New Yorker or for Time Magazine or wherever. So I'd rather be in a position where I can brand myself, which I was able to do for the most of the time I was at the Reader, but not to the same extent, like in the last 2 or 3 years.
Is there any critics right now you're reading that you're liking? You mentioned earlier the community of people on the internet that know the 20-year-olds who know more about film than you. Is there anyone interesting you're reading right now?
I haven't been keeping up with Adrian Martin so much, but I'm trying to think of people who, certainly Jim Nairmore is somebody I read everything by and like an awful lot by. I haven't been able to it's been harder to keep up with Chris Fujiwara, but I like his pieces a lot. There are certain critics in French that that I like reading. There's a young woman who I've only read 2 or 3 pieces by her, but they really impressed me a lot. Muriel Joudin. Yeah, sorry. Last I heard she was in her 20s, but I don't know if she still is. That was a while ago. I like reading Bordwell sometimes. I don't always agree with him, but I do like some of the things he writes. And, my friend Janet Bergstrom, who's recently retired full professor at UCLA, who is to me like the best American film historian now. She has just found out about, researched a project that F.W. Murnau had when he originally signed a deal with Fox to come to the States and he made Sunrise. Before doing Sunrise, he wanted to make a film that was called Frozen Justice, to be filmed and set in Alaska.
Wow.
And so I just read an essay by her about this, which is fascinating.
Would this have combined the technique that he ended up putting into Sunrise?
Who knows? Who knows? Because it never got far enough. It might have been quite different, In fact, it would have had to have been different if he was going to shoot some of it on location in Alaska. But it actually sounds like it has more in common with Taboo, actually, because he was partly concerned with native people, like Eskimos, and the difference between civilization and Aboriginals and so on. So I think it would have been closer to something like Taboo, probably.
Ted, you had those series of quotes you had written down. Do we want to finish off? He's has some favorite quotes he pulled out of here. I just wonder.
Well, that was just these recent ones that
I found them pretty interesting.
Yeah,
do you mind?
The interview you did with David Walsh on the World Socialist website.
Yes.
Yeah, there were some good quotes here where you that really stuck out to me. Like, cinema is concerned with the world and not with an alternative to it. I thought that was an interesting statement, because we tend to think, it seems like a lot of fandom today, film fans, that movies are their alternative. They don't really see that as being considered.
The escape from reality idea.
If I have a slogan, it's "If in dreams begin responsibilities," which is a line from William Butler Yeats.
Okay, yes. And then he said, cinema belongs to the world, including us. Film is important because it addresses the way we live. And I've always been impressed with you. You're always a big champion of world cinemas and third world, that things that we tend to just, whether where we're living or we just tend to gloss over.
Or the anti-American bias and just a pro-American bias in film going and the culture and the film criticism.
Well, I have to say that I'm an American, and as being an American, I'm a provincial in a lot of ways, even though I've, traveled a lot and lived in Europe and so on. I still feel I'm very provincial. And one thing that's provincial about me is that I learn about other countries through seeing movies made there, which is not necessarily the best way of learning about other countries. But even so, because it is my main method, it seems to me that it becomes very valuable. And whereas in the 60s, the excitement of seeing Godard films in the 60s was that they would be like global newspapers. You would go to a Godard film to find out what's happening in the world. Whereas it seemed to me that in the 90s, you would go to Abbas Kiarostami to find out what was going on in the world. And the fact that his films were not set in the big cities was significant, because what's happening in the world is not necessarily happening in the big cities. It's like the same big companies are doing the same things everywhere. So what's happening in the middle of nowhere and The Wind Will Carry Us is what's happening all over the world in terms of the difference between, the media person and the locals It just seems to me that there's a lot we can learn from film apart from, I think that there's a part of it has to do with the anti-intellectualism of American life. And it's also the anti-art position, because I've often, maybe this is being excessive, but it sometimes seems to me that America may be the only country in the world that actually hates art. I mean, almost every country in the world gives money to the arts, whereas it seems to me people really don't like the idea of the government giving, unless they give money to, it's often said that America gives more money to military marching bands than to all the other art forms combined.
Well, it seems like, at the very least, America likes the commercial form of art that they can use in the kind of Aldous Huxley way, at the various way. But, like, I don't know. It's the federal government is not going. The NEA is not paying for artists anymore, and it's definitely not paying for artists that cannot make money for corporations.
Well, right, but I think the funny thing is, I don't think anybody knows what the audience wants, because all we know about what the audience wants is what the industry tells us, and they don't know either. So it's like, they're full of self-fulfilling prophecies.
That's also that's a good point to make, both in like the filmmaking gatekeepers and in criticism. One of the things I've always liked about your writing is you always are pushing against groupthink. Yeah.
Well, at least I try to. But I mean, I have my own forms of groupthink too. I mean, I'm influenced by friends and people I read and so on too. It's just a different group. And also, I define my group internationally rather than locally. Because that's the other thing that I think is sort of like something I feel that I'm a beneficiary of. The thing that I feel lucky about having my website, because it means that my readership is international, even though it's limited by people who read English, obviously. But
that kind of goes. I love this quote here too. This is one of your quotes. I argue strongly that the critic should not have the first or the last word. And I just, to me, that has always been something I've always have felt strongly about without really thinking about it much. A lot of my friends might say, "Oh, Ted, you're reading too much reviews and not making up your own mind." But sometimes I need a little help. I need a little prompting to help, figure out what I'm thinking about. And so you will go to a review and check it out after I see a film.
That is a conversation.
Well, I always thought that Godard had it right when he actually thought that for him, cinema was not only seeing films, but also reading about films and writing about films. In other words, he saw it all as part of the same thing. So even though most of my colleagues will say that they won't read a review of a film until after they've seen it, made up their own mind, I've never had this bias. I sometimes read, reviews before I see films. And to me, it's just part of the discussion. It's like a discussion that goes on between films and between films and other films, between films and reviews, and so on. I don't believe that films should necessarily be cut off from the world, as I guess, which is to link it to an earlier argument, that you were citing. And one way of connecting it to the world is connecting it to, the discourse we have about other things.
I think that's a good spot to end on. So, Jonathan Rosenbaum, I wanted to thank you for being on the podcast.
Yes, thank you so much. You were one of our heroes, and really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Well, no, thank you.